This morning we will continue our readings from the Gospel of John. This is a whole series of readings that help us focus on loving like Christ loves. So let us hear now, beginning with John 14, beginning verse 23. Jesus replied, "If anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. He who does not love me will not obey my teaching. These words you hear are not my own. They belong to the Father who sent me. All this I have spoken while still with you. But the Counselor, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and remind you of everything I have said to you. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. You heard me say that I am going away, and I am coming back to you. If you loved me, you would be glad that I'm going to the Father, for the Father is greater than I. And I have told you now before it happens, so when it does happen, you will believe." God's word for God's people.
Thanks be to God.
If you love me, you'll do what I say. If you love me, you'll do what I told you to do, and only then will you be loved. Does that sound like what we just read? No. I think if any of us would ever claim to be experts on Jesus, we probably would be lying to say we were an expert. But I think most of us know him well enough to know that he would never say something like that. You see, the Jesus that we know and that we follow is not shaming or manipulative. He doesn't try to put a guilt trip on us. He is not wrathful. He is not authoritarian. But he is loving. And Jesus tells us in this text today that he doesn't give like the world gives, causing our hearts to be troubled and fearful, waiting that at any moment that his love could be removed or pulled away from us. But that indeed, even if we do things that displease him, his love never goes away. And that's why Jesus is the one who brings us peace. So if that's the case, then what is John talking about in this gospel reading when he writes, "Those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them"? You see, for John, it's always the love comes first. It's though, and it's through Jesus having loved us, and by God's grace and through our baptisms, our loving Jesus, and trying to center our lives on him, and trying to keep Jesus' words in our hearts, that it even can become possible. And this word that Jesus says will keep our love for him, but will also keep us understanding what kind of love this is he calls us to. Last week we talked about the commandment, this new commandment that Jesus gave his disciples. We understood that this took precedence over every other commandment from God or through Jesus when he said to love one another. And I think John really stays with this theme. He's often been called the apostle of love because this was most central and most crucial message that Jesus came to give us. And yet centering on love is not the end of it for John. Because coupled to this love, a matter of fact, indescribably connected to it, was an understanding that we have a call to have love in action. And if we kept reading after this 14th chapter of John and went further, we would hear that Jesus repeated the new commandment and clarified it when he said, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends." So last week we talked about this on Sunday. We talked about it again in Wednesday Bible study. That the disciples could have chosen to hear this clarification that Jesus gave them in the same way that they could choose to hear the commandment itself. They could choose to hear that love one another commandment as saying, love those right here in this room who we already care about. Or to hear that lay down your life for your friends, meaning to die as necessary for those you already care about. But I think it would have been really hard to have hung out with Jesus for all this time, and by this point in John's gospel, to stick to that version of reality. But I guess it was possible. But I think what was even harder still was to ignore what was to come next. Because soon after Jesus gave these words to the disciples, he was arrested and taken away to die on the cross. And that's why we are reminded in this Gospel of John that love is both a noun and a verb, and that they find their highest interpretation in the person of Jesus himself. No one has a greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Phew. So what does it look like to us? What does it call us to do? Does Jesus mean for us to literally lay down our lives for our friends? Maybe. It's certainly possible that some of us could be called to martyrdom for the sake of others and for the sake of the faith. But I think for most of us it's a little less dramatic than that, probably no less heroic. Because to die for others means giving up something we have in order that someone who doesn't have or has less may have. And it might look like dying to ourselves when it comes to money or our food or to shelter, or maybe dying to ourselves when it comes to comfort or privilege or safety. And when we do what we want to do, thinking only of ourselves, I think in a way we rebel against Jesus and we disgrace Jesus to be the only author of salvation and eternal relationships. Any decision that we make that attempts to rival Jesus' plan for us as his followers is indeed the scheme of a rebel. I think back to a car I had a long time ago. It was my first talking car. Anybody had a talking car? Okay. There was a man in North Carolina who bought this talking car. And mine was about an 85 Nissan Maxima. And it was hard to get used to having a talking car. She would always say to me, your door is ajar. And I'm going, no, it's a door. It's not a jar. And so the way she would split up a jar into a jar always made me argue with her. And so this guy got a car that was talking to him. And it had a voice warning system. And at first he thought it was pretty funny to have this little soft female voice reminding him gently to do something. Reminding him gently that his seatbelt needed to be fastened. And so he affectionately referred to her as the little woman. He soon discovered that the little woman was programmed to also remind him and warn him about his fuel level. When she would say, your fuel level is low. And so she said it in a sweet voice to him. And Edwin nodded and he thanked the little woman. And he figured he still had 50 miles or so left. He didn't need to go with what she was saying, so he kept driving. And a few minutes later, in her soft voice, she repeated, your fuel level is low. And so it began over and over and over again until Edwin got to the point that her voice sounded harsher to him every time she would repeat it. So finally he got over on the side of the road and he got up under his dash and he figured out which wire controlled the little voice and he pulled it loose. So much for the little woman. And so he was smiling to himself at how brilliant he'd been to hush up the little woman when his car began to sputter and cough. He had run out of gas. And somewhere inside the dashboard, dashboard, Edwin was sure he could still hear the little woman, and she was laughing this time. And there are people who are like Edwin. They hear that little voice softly reminding them, softly telling them what they should be doing. But perhaps we, like Edwin, rather ignore it or even disconnect that little voice. We don't want to be told what to do. But it is that not listening to the little voice that speaks inside our hearts from the Holy Spirit that helps us contribute to the failures we see in our community, and failures that happen within our own lives, and failures that happen within our country. Because we make choices to rebel when we don't think beyond what we want, when we don't listen to that still small voice. And it's heartbreaking for us to watch, especially as we watch Christians. But it isn't a new phenomenon. It's happened before, and the gospel has survived. The message continued. But when God's people don't get distracted, and instead remember that they are not to watch out only for their own needs and desires, but instead remember that that still small voice in their hearts calls for them to offer the gospel to their neighbor, to die to their own needs, to take and love others more than we love ourselves. And God's not failing us when we make choices to rebel because we don't think beyond what we need or what we want. We get so busy thinking of our own needs. It's really hard to squeeze in about the needs of others, to love others. That's when the Holy Spirit comes in. And the Holy Spirit speaks to us reminders in that still small voice. And that Holy Spirit will remind us over and over and over and over for our whole lives that the will of God is never far from us. And that He uses the Holy Spirit to remind us of all that Jesus has taught us. And He does it until it sinks into these thick skulls of ours. And we do what God's will is. Teach and remind. Teach and remind. All who teach. Shirley can give me an amen on this one. It's not just teaching. It's teaching and reminding, teaching and reminding. It is a cycle that goes on and on. And it's not a government program. It won't start up in the White House or the Capitol. It happens from the heart of a Christian. An elderly grandmother who reaches over, and as she gives her grandchild a cookie, she reminds her grandchild to give thanks in everything. It's a lesson that costs us investing in the lives of our neighbors, our community, and it's a message that can transform the world just like it's transformed our lives. But then it makes us wonder, are we willing to risk ourselves? Are we willing to lay down our lives emotionally, socially, maybe even physically? Jesus said, no one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. So what does that look like? What does that look like to us? What does it look like to us as a congregation in this point in time? And I don't know exactly. And since my own time with you will be ending in a few weeks, I can emphatically tell you what I see as God works in and through each of you. I see a church that is one of the most loving places I've ever been part of. I see a church where people know how to engage with each other and speak civilly to one another, even when they disagree. I see a church who's willing to explore difficult topics, difficult ideas, where our own theology seems to be battered from the words of the world. where we're able to speak with one another about a variety of topics because we see ourselves as brothers and sisters. John Wesley reminded his followers, and he reminds us all, that we don't all have to think alike to love alike. How wonderful if the world could live into that. To have a faith in the one who binds us all together in love. And to remember that even when we struggle, even when it's hard, and maybe we don't agree with our friends or our family or our community, and our heart feels differently about a topic, we understand that Jesus promised to help us. John's gospel tells us that the Holy Spirit has a special task. And we don't have to worry if we forget how to love. We can forget. Have you ever forgotten how to love and said or done things that were not loving? So far today, maybe I haven't hit it, but give me the rest of the day. And so the Holy Spirit takes and comes and helps us remember. We don't have to worry if we forget or if we mess up or if our loving others looks clumsy or incomplete. Because Jesus assured his disciples, as he assures each of us, that he will never leave us alone. And so when we look at the word Holy Spirit in Greek, Parakletos, it's translated as advocate, comforter, counselor, helper, and describes a spirit who remains at our side forever, to represent us, to defend us, to argue our case, to give us peace, and to counsel us as necessary. The Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, will teach you all things and remind you of all that I've said to you. Jesus taught the disciples a whole lot of things, many that they wouldn't even remember until after the resurrection. And that's when he gave them the Holy Spirit to help them remember his teachings and to interpret those teachings for their unique situations. The Holy Spirit, the one that stands next to them day and night, making all things clear. Lately, I've had a couple of young people in my life trying to help me make clear how not to lose my church keys. Rebecca, okay, all right? And so my daughter finally took Rebecca's suggestions and got me one of these things. Anybody got one?
Yeah.
All right, it's called a tile. I love it because I lose my keys no more than 3 times a day. And so I need help remembering where my keys are. And so I have a way, if I can find my phone, I tend to lose it less. Okay? I do lose the keys with regularity. And so, let me see if I can make it do it. Oh, my bad, I'm doing it wrong. Rebecca, okay. Well, anyway, when you remember how to use the app on your phone, it makes your little keys sing. So if they're lost, if you lose your keys, your phone, if you can work it, will help you find them, okay? And that's the way the Holy Spirit is with us. All we have to do is call on the Holy Spirit to help us remember the things we have forgotten that we once knew. I once knew to hang my keys in the same place every day. Don't remember that too good anymore. So the Holy Spirit will keep on teaching you until you remember the things that Jesus taught you. And if you do act on what the Holy Spirit brings into your memory, you might find yourself blessing the poor in spirit, helping the brokenhearted, clothing the naked, healing the sick, feeding the hungry. There was a kid named Doug, and he was just 15 years old, lived in Missouri. He hadn't been feeling very well. His mom finally took him to the hospital. No. It's singing at me again. I guess it thinks I'm still lost. Okay. I've only had it a week since Mother's Day. I'll get it down this time. About 6 months from now I'll have it. Okay. So this kid named Doug, and his mom took him over to the hospital, and they soon diagnosed Doug with a terrible diagnosis, with leukemia. Explained to him about this disease. They told him it would take 3 years a really, really strong chemotherapy to lick it. And they didn't sugarcoat the side effects. They said he'd lose all of his beautiful hair. He'd bloat up and swell up. And all of this made Doug feel very depressed. And so his aunt, who saw how depressed he was, decided she wanted to bring a little cheer to the hospital room. So she called a florist and asked for some flowers to be delivered. And while she was ordering the flowers, she told the person at the flower shop that they were for her teenage nephew who had leukemia. And so the flowers came to the hospital room, and Doug read the card from his aunt without much emotion. Then he noticed on the other side there was a second card. And he pulled the card out and he read the card, and it said, I'm 22 years old, but when I was 7, I had leukemia too. Good luck with your treatment, and my heart is with you. Sincerely, Laura Bradley. She was the clerk who fixed his order at the florist shop. Her small token of care warmed his heart like no doctor or nurse or million-dollar equipment at the hospital could help him. That one brief action, when her heart was prompted to reach out and love to somebody else, made all the difference in the world to 15-year-old Doug. And it gave him hope. And he knew he could carry on through these dark days that were in front of him. And that's what the Spirit does for us. It assures us we will never be abandoned, whether we're in the midst of pain or loss or illness, whatever sorrow we might find ourselves in. The Spirit will be with us throughout our life, no matter how broken our world may be. You see, this is what Jesus taught, and this is what the Spirit reminds us of. May it be so in our lives.